Before I respond fully to the Right Honourable Gentleman's this debate today, I'd like to reflect briefly on the horror that unfolded last week at Grenfell Tower. My thoughts are still very much with the victims, their families and their friends. You all have heard of the Prime Minister's statement earlier today. Having visited the site for myself and met with some of the bereaved families, I'd like to echo her determination to get to the bottom of whatever went wrong. I will also be writing to honourable members shortly with a detailed update on what we're doing to support the people that have been affected by this tragedy, the progress we're making in rehousing people, and what steps we're taking to improve fire safety at similar tower blocks across the country. But in the longer term, and perhaps more pertinent to this particular debate, I think it's clear that any changes in the wake of this tragedy shouldn't just be technical or to legislation. What happened at Grenfell Tower was that we also showed us all that we need a change in attitude. We all need to rethink our approach to social housing, and we need to reflect on the way that successive governments have engaged with and responded to social tenants. We don't yet know for sure whether this disaster could have been avoided if the people who called Grenfell Tower their home had been listened to. But we do know that for far too long that their voices fell on deaf ears. So if nothing else, let the legacy of Grenfell be that such voices will never, ever be ignored again. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it's good, first of all, to see the Right Honourable Gentleman in his place. I'm delighted to welcome him back after the general election. I'm even more delighted that neither of us have swapped places since the election. I know that we have a great deal in common. Perhaps we use the same barbers. But it's also always a pleasure debating with the Right Honourable Gentleman, and I look forward to doing that regularly over the next 5 years. Yes, I will, of course.
This debate, which is largely about housing, could my right honourable friend see whether it's possible to have a debate on leasehold, where he could look to see whether the government can intervene on the Mundy decision, M-U-N-D-Y, which affects 2 million leaseholders on their extension of leases, and see whether he can carry on the work of his former deputy, Gavin Barwell, on reforming the lease advisory service, so that those leaseholders who ought, frankly, to be on common hold can actually get a better service and avoid being abused intentionally or unintentionally by managing agents and freeholders. Very good point.
Mr. Speaker, I agree very much with my honourable friend. It is very important to continue that work on leasehold reform, and we will certainly be taking it forward. And let me take this opportunity also to thank my honourable friend for all the work that he has done and the contribution he has made to that reform debate. We've got a resilient... I will give way.
I thank him for giving way. Since 2012-13, when the government introduced the increased discount right to buy, there's been 51,352 homes sold. Over that period, in terms of replacement and so-called one-for-one, there's only been 9,344 starts on site. Now that's starts, not completions. Is that what he means with a new attitude to social housing?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, if the honourable gentleman bears with me, he will see very clearly what the government's track record is on social housing. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the progress that we've made since the government first took office in 2010, we've got a resilient, growing economy. The labour market is in the strongest position for years. The claimant count is at its lowest level for 45 years. Millions of more people are in work compared to 2010. That's thanks in part to our wide-ranging process of welfare reform. 520,000 people are receiving universal credit, helping to transform lives and making sure that people are always better off in work than on benefits. In the last year, the number of disabled people in work has increased by more than 170,000. DWP has also launched tailored support for people with a disability or ill health through our personal support package. We remain, of course, committed to a strong, humane welfare safety net. Every year we spend some £90 billion supporting families, people with disabilities, job seekers and people on low incomes. By 2020, we will have given local authorities £1 billion in discretionary housing payments for residents who may need extra help. And I will, of course.
I thank the Minister for giving way. You mentioned about the extra money to people on disability benefit. Would the Minister agree with me that changing work-related, i.e. the RAG component, so that people in RAG from April this year will receive £30 a week less, is hardly the most intelligent way to persuade disabled people to get back into employment?
I can tell the Honourable Gentleman, where that happens, we will be compensating through other ways and making sure that the welfare policy remains fair to everyone. Mr. Deputy Speaker, also we have, in the last year, we've spent £24 billion on housing benefit, helping people to cope with the ever-increased cost of housing. But we're not just tackling the symptoms of our broken housing market, we're also taking real action to fix the causes too. Our housing white paper, which was published earlier this year, set out exactly how we are going to go about that. Releasing more land where people want to live. Building the homes that we need faster. Getting more companies involved in the housing market and supporting people who need help now. The Queen's Speech, which promises proposals to help ensure that more homes are built, marks a significant step in turning that blueprint into bricks and mortar. I will, of course.
The Secretary of State mentioned the Housing White Paper, which I thought was a terrific document. In his little list, then, he neglected one thing, given that the Self-Build and Custom House Building Act is now on the statute book and was indeed strengthened by the government in his Housing and Planning Bill last year. Does he think that the role of service plots, and indeed particularly land pooling, may also have an important role to play?
First of all, Mr. Deputy Speaker, let me say I agree very much with the statement that my honourable friend just made about the importance of self-build and factory build, making sure there's enough plots for that. That's why a key part of the Housing White Paper was to work on how we can diversify the market further. And let me also thank him for the work that he's done, and I know that he continues to do in this sector. He's made a real significant contribution. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we're also investing more than £7 billion through the Affordable Homes Programme. This will provide funding to housing associations, to local authorities and other providers to deliver 225,000 affordable housing starts by March 21. We are also making the Affordable Homes Programme more flexible, so that it now funds a range of affordable homes for rent as well as home ownership. This will enable providers to build a range of homes to suit their needs. And my most urgent priority continues to be getting rough sleepers off our streets. So we'll be establishing a homelessness reduction task force, piloting Housing First and implementing the Homelessness Reduction Act so that more people are helped earlier. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in the wake of the Grenfell Tower tragedy, it's more important than ever that we continue to support housing associations and local authorities with their plans to regenerate housing estates. We have already paid out some £32 million in grants to support early phase work with local residents. We are providing practical support and guidance to ensure that tenants are at the heart of all new regeneration schemes and that their rights are protected. And we shall continue to assess bids to allocate £290 million of project finance. But that's not all. We're determined to make all types of housing more affordable and secure for ordinary working people. And that's why we will be legislating to stop tenants being charged fees for renting out a property. This will mean tenants can see, at a glance, exactly what an advertised property will cost them with no hidden or upfront charges. It will also stop unscrupulous agents who rip off tenants with unjustifiable and opaque fees. Full details will be in a draft tenants' fees bill, which we expect to publish during the first session of this Parliament. Mr. Deputy Speaker, can we deliver all this? Yes, we can. Just look at our track record so far. Since 2010, we've delivered 893,000 additional homes, including 330,000 affordable homes. Mr Deputy Speaker, since 2010, house building starts have increased by more than 3/4. Over 382,000 households have been helped to buy a property through schemes like Help to Buy and the reinvigorated Right to Buy. I will. Please.
I'm extremely grateful to the Secretary of State. In these changed times, when he's telling us about his record, is it still government policy that housing associations should be required to sell off homes faster than they can be built?
It is government policy that people should have the right to buy their homes, whether it's a council house, whether it's a housing association property. And at the moment, the honourable gentleman will know we are trialling and piloting how the housing association right to buy programme is working, and then we will work to see how we take that forward. Mr Deputy Speaker, yes, I will.
On the phone for giving way. Just on that point, the housing associations in London have made it very clear collectively that they are willing and able to massively ramp up the number of homes they're building. But the one thing they ask from government is that the government accelerates the release of publicly owned land so that they can do so. Is that still very much part of the agenda?
My honourable friend touched on a very important point. The public sector land programme is designed to do just that, and in the last 7 years it's released record amounts of land for hundreds of thousands of new homes. There's always more to do, and that's why in the Housing White Paper we set out plans to achieve even more from that programme. Now, since 2010, Mr Deputy Speaker, I can tell the members opposite one more thing. More council housing has been built in the past 7 years than in the previous 13 years. Enough public sector land, going back to my honourable friend's question, has been released to deliver at least 130,000 new homes. That's equivalent to a city the size of Nottingham. More than 300,000 new homes were granted planning permission in a year up to March, up 15% on the previous 12 months. New build dwellings starts are rising by 15% compared to the previous period, and once people are in their homes, they're staying in them because mortgage repossessions are at their lowest level for 35 years. So this government can offer an ambitious, far-reaching plan for the future of house building built on solid foundations of real success. Only this government can deliver the homes and the housing that the market reforms and what this country needs. Only this government can provide the economic strength we need for house builders to thrive in a post-Brexit world. And only this Queen's speech takes the first steps to fixing our broken housing market, and that, Mr Speaker, is why I'm delighted to commend it to the House.
Yeah. Right, John Healey.
I wasn't watching it.
Thank you, Mr Howarth. This is the first time, I think, that you've been in the chair in this chamber, and I welcome you to that. Can I also welcome almost all our Labour colleagues back to the House after the election, and can I welcome all 87 new members from all sides to this House. Ours is a very special job and a very special responsibility as elected members of this House. And can I, last but not least, welcome the Secretary of State and his old team and a new housing minister back to the front bench. Sadly, he comes with no new ideas or no new plans to deal with the housing crisis in this country, Mr Howarth. But these are really extraordinary times. A government bench without a government, a Prime Minister who can't even seal a deal with the DUP. You
were right the first time.
and she might have better luck with the DWP. But she can't seal the deal with the DUP, and a Queen's speech with no guarantee of the numbers even to approve it. This is the first minority government in this country for 38 years. She called this election. She called this election expecting a bigger majority and saying she wanted a stronger mandate. Well, now she has no mandate, no majority, and no authority. Yeah. And normally, Mr Howarth, the Queen's speech sets out what the government will do. This Queen's speech sets out what it won't do, can't do, and daren't do. It won't make the economic changes to invest for the future and protect our public services. It can't put forward a full programme for government. because she can't yet do the deal with the DUP, and they daren't even implement their own manifesto and have taken it down from their website. Give way.
There are plenty of heavyweight people around, and I'm hoping the right honourable gentleman is going to get on to housing at some point. Does he agree with the Redfern review, which he commissioned, that Help to Buy has the potential to be inflationary? And does he further agree that it might be better to switch the money towards Help to Build, which in every single case, not so with Help to Buy, Help to Build would in every single case result in extra housing being built?
Well, Mr. Howarth, we need to do both, of course, and actually the major flaw with Help to Buy is that nearly a fifth of the people being helped to buy through this scheme are not even first-time buyers, and there are nearly 4,000 people being helped by Help to Buy on incomes of over £100,000. So this is not well targeted, it's not good use of public money, it could be spent much better, especially helping younger people with ordinary incomes get that first foot on the housing market. Now, I will give way, of course.
He says that £100,000 income is too high to qualify for Help to Buy. What level would he set it at?
We'd be very happy to consult on that, but my main argument is with ministers. They're making the wrong judgments. They're not putting in place the help that particularly younger people need, which is why, and he may know this, since 2010, we've seen the number of homeowners, Mr. Howarth, who are under 45 fall by 900,000. Young people's hopes and dreams of ever owning their home at the moment are completely dashed, and the government has no plan in this Queen's speech or in their manifesto to fix it. In truth, Mr. Howarth, this is a Prime Minister who's locked in place by her party only until they judge they can dump her without facing the British people again in a fresh election. And it was Margaret Thatcher that said, and I quote, "Minority governments can only struggle on from day to day with a series of short-term measures. They can't, and they don't, tackle the longer-term questions that affect the future of our nation and the well-being of all of us." And the question for this Queen's speech is, will this short-term be days, weeks, or months? And on the 8th of June, this Prime Minister asked the people for their judgment on 7 years of Conservative government, and they gave it. Real wages falling, government debt rising, investment in new transport and housing slashed, the NHS in crisis, schools cutting teachers, more than 1 million people last year using a food bank. And at the same time, big income tax cuts for the very top earners and more tax cuts to come for the very richest on wealth they don't even earn. 7 years of failure, a party with no answers to the problems people face, no hope for the future, no plan to change the country for the better or make government work for the interests of all. Now, I now turn to the specific theme for today's debate on housing and to Grenfell Tower. The Prime Minister was right today to apologise, right today to admit that government was too slow, local and national, and right also to take charge herself. However, amongst a set of important commitments, which we welcome, she set a number of hairs running and failed to answer a number of really important questions. My right honourable friend earlier on from Hammersmith made the point that the safety checks that are imperative on all 4,000 tower blocks around the country aren't just about cladding, they're about all aspects of fire prevention and fire safety. And the Secretary of State needs to make clear that these checks will be comprehensive, they will be rapid, and if local authorities need support and resources to carry these out, that will be made available from government. He also needs to make it clear, which the Prime Minister did not, if remedial work is required in order to make these blocks safe, and funding is required to do that, then the government will provide that funding to make sure those buildings are made safe for their residents. Of course.
Mr Deputy Speaker, thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way, the Honourable Gentleman. I mean, he's absolutely right. The checks need to be absolutely comprehensive. I think everyone is agreed on that, and all local authorities are carrying out those checks. Many of them already done so, but they're in the process. Every single local authority that my department has been in contact with. And we've made it clear to them in terms of making the testing facility available for free. We have said we will pay for all the tests. And we have also made it clear, as the Prime Minister did today from this dispatch box, is that if there's a local authority that, in terms of implementing any necessary changes, needs support and help, then we will work with that local authority to provide it.
So, Mr Howarth, support and help and funding if they need it. Is that what the Secretary is saying to this House? Yes or no?
Are they paying the bill?
Thank you. What we've made clear is exactly that. If there's a local authority that needs support, including funding support, we will work with them to provide funding support.
Mr Deputy Speaker, Mr Howarth, I am grateful for that. I think the House is grateful for that. Finally, it's taken probably a dozen questions to him and to the Prime Minister and to the Leader of the House during the course of the day to get that statement, but it is, of course, welcome. Now, I pay tribute to the Prime Minister for her leadership, having acknowledged that the government was slow to get a grip of this and appreciate the scale of the tragedy. I also pay tribute to the leadership of the Mayor of London, who I think has given very strong voice to the concerns of local communities and residents, and strong leadership to the emergency services that have struggled to deal with the tragedy. I also pay tribute to the outstanding work and leadership of my new honourable friend, the member for Kensington. She's been simply magnificent over this, essentially her first week in the job as a member of this Parliament. And I thank my less new honourable friends, the members for Paddington and for Westminster, both of whom know the area well, and as neighbouring MPs have spent much of the last week with her. Mr Howarth, I was with our Labour leader in Kensington the day after the fire, and firefighters with over 30 years' experience all told us that they had never, ever seen anything like this. And the police commander on site was right when she said to me, "You have to be here to appreciate how truly apocalyptic this fire was." And this was not a natural disaster, it was man-made. And it should never have happened, and it must never happen again. And we in this House, on all sides, have a deep responsibility to make sure that it does not. Now, some have said, don't make or try and score political points about the tragedy. But, Mr Howarth, this is precisely about politics, about ideology and about policy, what this House is here to debate and to decide. And it's precisely the political and policy decisions taken by those in power that the residents and communities affected by this terrible tragedy want us to tackle. Now, the Prime Minister has talked about the lessons to learn, promised all necessary actions will be taken after the investigation. And as the official opposition, we will not rest until those who need help and a new home have it. Anyone culpable has been held fully to account, and every measure is in place to prevent this ever happening again. But surely this must shock the country into changes in the policy, ideology and responsibility of government. When a country as decent and well-off as ours fails to provide something as basic as a safe and decent home to all our citizens, then things must change. And when this happens in one of the richest parts of the country, it offends our sense that we live together as one nation, with each and every person with a right to be treated and valued with equal worth by our society and by our government. So things must change. First, for decades after the Second World War, there was a cross-party consensus about the value of social housing. There was also a recognition that in only 1 year since then have we built more than 200,000 homes in this country without councils doing at least a third. And you know, Mr Howarth, 2015 was probably the first year since that Second World War when central government provided no new funding to build new social rented homes. Labour's Decent Homes programme to overhaul and upgrade social housing has been ended. And last year, ministers ended the secure long-term tenancies for council tenants. And the Secretary of State talked about their track record on social housing. My honourable friend for Westminster exposed it. The tables, I'll just finish this point. The tables are here. Perhaps the Secretary of State could ask his officials for this. Table 1012. Honourable friend gave the figures for the number of starts. I'll give him the number of actually social homes completed that people can live in. It was 37,000 when Labour left. Last year it was just over 1,000. That is the track record on social housing of this government. This must change, and I give way.
I thank the gentleman. He just referred to the decent home standard for social housing. The programme has not been ended. In fact, since 2010, 1.7 billion has been provided, and as a result of this government's work, the number of homes that are failing to meet the decent home standard is down from its peak in 2007 by 41%.
So could you confirm to the House exactly how much is in the Homes and Communities Agency programme this year and last year for investment from government in the Decent Homes programme?
I'll be happy to write to him and give him the exact number.
Good, it's a small number and it has a 0 in it and nothing else. Second, can I say to the Secretary of State, to come back to the serious points that I wish to make. All markets, organisations and consumers need regulation to guarantee safety, to ensure fair practices, to safeguard standards and to stop abuse. Yet this is not the mindset of current Conservative ministers, and never again can we have a government minister challenged on fire safety measures saying it is not the government's responsibility, and justifying this with the government's one in, two out rule on regulations. This must change. Of course I give way again.
I'm very grateful to him. He must accept, though, it is this government that's brought in the improved regulations to insist on smoke alarms and CO and carbon monoxide detectors in homes, in rented sector homes, and for the first time requiring electrical safety checks and appliances checks from this autumn. He accepts that those new regulations have been brought in by this government.
But my goodness, didn't people, including we, have to argue hard for those basic sort of regulations? And why was it that he and his colleagues, when the Housing and Planning Bill was going through, rejected the intervention and the regulation to ensure that all private landlords should at least make their homes fit for human habitation before they rent them? I mean, this is a government with a mindset that concedes regulation only as red tape and not the important, as the Prime Minister said, role for good regulation in the public interest. Of course I give way.
Of the right honourable gentleman giving way. Can I just put it to him that really the last thing that people want to see now is parties turning this into a party political argument. And it would be equally easy for us to point out that the 2006 regulations were what this government inherited from his government. So if there was a failure of regulation, I think it is shared. And I think what the public wants to see is this House taking a full and shared collective responsibility for what has happened and putting it right instead of trying to accuse each other to score political points.
This is precisely about politics, precisely what this House should do. It's precisely, in fact, what the Prime Minister said this morning. So my third point comes off the back of hers when she talked about the fundamental issues that underpin the detail of what we've also been discussing. And that is sections of our people in this country feel marginalised and ignored. And that happened to the tenants and residents at Grenfell Tower. It's no good him huffing and puffing. The Prime Minister said this morning. She recognised this, but This has been a government whose housing regulator has now dropped any real requirement for the voice and views of tenants on residents on governing boards, and in 2010 abolished the national tenant voice that we'd set up in government. That came out of a report called Citizens of Equal Worth. And I have to say that many Grenfell residents and other social housing tenants will see that as ringing hollow in this day and age. Now let me come to the specific failures on housing. 2/3 of the people in this country now believe the country has a housing crisis. Everyone knows someone who's affected, unable to get a home they need or aspire to. Many of the decisions that he boasts about by ministers on housing since 2010 have made the problems worse. They've done too little for first-time buyers on ordinary incomes, so home ownership has now fallen to a 30-year low. They've given private landlords a freer hand, rejected legislation to require properties to be fit for human habitation, so 11 million private renters have fewer consumer rights than they have when they buy a fridge freezer. They've stripped away protection for people who need help with housing, so the number of people sleeping rough on our streets has more than doubled. And they've cut investment and outsourced responsibility for building new homes to big developers, so fewer new homes have been built on average since 2010 than under any peacetime government since the 1920s. That's the Secretary of State and his colleagues' track record. And after 7 years of failure, it's clear the Conservatives have no plan to fix the country's housing crisis. Some of what the Secretary of State has said this afternoon and has said before on house building and on tenants' fees are welcome. There is nothing in the manifesto in this Queen's speech to tackle the wider causes of the housing crisis. I've given way twice to him and I want to finish so others can speak. Nothing to change the scandal of rising rough sleeping homelessness. Nothing to deal with the lowest level of new affordable house building in this country for 24 years. Nothing to reverse the rapidly falling level of home ownership among young people. Nothing to secure supported and sheltered housing for the future. Nothing to scrap the hated bedroom tax. But there is an alternative. There is an alternative, Mr Howarth, as we showed in our Labour manifesto at this election. It is possible to fix the failings in the housing market and in housing policy, not just a fully fledged new Department for Housing, to reflect how serious the crisis is and to spearhead our New Deal on housing and tackle that crisis. A New Deal for first-time buyers with no stamp duty, guaranteed first dibs on new homes built in their local area, and 100,000 new first-buy homes at a discount price linked to local average incomes. A New Deal for homeowners to stop leaseholders being ripped off. A new homeowner guarantee to help pay the mortgage if people lose their job. A New Deal on house building with at least 1 million new homes built over this Parliament, and a new target to see 250,000 new homes built by 2022, a level that should then be sustained each year for the following 5 years in the next Parliament. A New Deal on affordable homes, to build at least 100,000 genuinely affordable homes to rent and buy a year, with the biggest council house building programme for over 30 years. A New Deal for private renters to establish new consumer rights with legal minimum standards, as well as making 3-year tenancies the norm, with an inflation cap on rent rises. And finally, a New Deal on homelessness, with a new national mission and plan to end rough sleeping, not sometime in the future like the Secretary of State says, but within the next Parliament. So in conclusion, Mr Deputy Speaker, ministers have no domestic programme in this Queen's speech and no majority in this House of Commons. So I offer them our New Deal on housing, a New Deal on housing between the people of this country and the government. A bold, long-term plan to start to fix our country's housing crisis, to meet people's housing needs and aspirations. If they're also willing to offer people this hope, then I offer them Labour's support in putting it into practice. But if they will not, then they'll have to make way for a party that can change the country for the better, that can make government work for the many and not for the few.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I associate myself with the comments of honourable and right honourable members across this House on the tragic incident at Grenfell Tower? We on these benches welcome the inquiry and believe that lessons must be learned from this event. As I rise to speak on today's Queen's speech, however, it seems to me to be one of the most shambolic and lame legislative programmes in my lifetime. The Tories, cowed by their unnecessary election defeat, are working on a weak mandate with no authority. Since the start of this month, we have seen promises ditched as they face defeat across this House. Pledges on introducing an energy price cap, disastrous social care plans, a free vote on fox hunting, introducing grammar schools and setting an immigration target have all been dropped. And yesterday witnessed no mention of a deliberately harmful plan to scrap the triple lock on pensions. But yet again, this Queen's speech proves one thing: the Tories will continue their obsession with austerity in spite of a sea of evidence against it. Let me be clear, another Parliament of cuts is a choice, not a necessity. It is a choice. And this has been decisively rejected by voters across the country. As a result of the continuation of austerity, the Resolution Foundation has warned that it will drive the biggest inequality since the time of Margaret Thatcher. Now, on the matter of housing, of course, much of this legislation is devolved to the Scottish Government. However, we ended the right to buy some time ago with the view that unless housing has been replaced, then ultimately many people are disadvantaged and lack the opportunity to obtain affordable housing, something which this government has failed to learn. Turning, of course, to the matter of social security, another part of today's debate. Today's debate focuses on social security as well, and the High Court ruling on the benefit cap outlines that it causes a real damage to single families. When will this government learn its lesson? The outcomes of the poorest working age households will fall by 10% over the next 4 years, driving a further 1 million families across this country into poverty. By 2021, there could be more than 5 million children across the UK, a number equivalent to the total population of Scotland, living in poverty. This is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and that is a disgrace. But on these benches, we choose to take a different approach. Unlike those on the government benches and many on the opposition benches, the SNP have consistently and unapologetically opposed austerity. Our approach to public finances would balance the UK budget for day-to-day spending by the end of the Parliament. It would set a debt on a downward path, and crucially, it would free up additional £118 billion of public investment. With our plans, we could stop the further £9 billion of additional social security cuts that this government will inflict. It means that those on low incomes who rely on in-work social security and the vulnerable and disabled would not have to face further punishment. And despite the rhetoric from the Labour Party, their plans fail to provide the same protections. Mr Deputy Speaker, in my constituency, the cost of welfare reform is clear. Despite my constituency's assets, almost 25% of children in Lanark and Hamilton East grow up in poverty. Under this government, my constituents have had to endure a reduction in employment support allowance, a freeze on in-work support, cuts to their personal independence payments, and the removal of their mobility cars, and worst of all, they are now subject to a family cap and a despicable rape clause. Austerity has failed my constituents in Lanark and Hamilton East, and it has failed constituents up and down this country. However, in saying that, we are, for now, in a better position than some. My constituency is yet to face the massive ramifications of a rollout of universal credit. Later this year, the UK Government intends to introduce this universal credit in South Lanarkshire. This is a policy that only a few weeks ago the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations highlighted as a key concern in tackling homelessness across the country. And whilst the Scottish Government has plans to mitigate some of the worst elements of this UK Government's welfare reforms, including the rollout of universal credit, the same cannot be said for families across the UK, and it is completely unreasonable to suggest that we should continue to mitigate to the tune of 400 million the poor decisions of this UK Government. Universal credit will make some of my constituents homeless. Despite the work of local authorities and the third sector, the UK Government are intransigent and unrelenting in their approach. Mr Deputy Speaker, it is clear that austerity has failed the economy and it has failed society. It has driven people that we should protect into poverty, hunger, humiliation and crippling debt. I had, perhaps naively, hoped that their defeat earlier this month would make this Government reflect on their approach to social security, listen to the experts and inject the investment necessary to genuinely rebalance the economy and create a fairer society. At the very heart of it, that is what a social security system ought to do, and yet is exactly what this UK Government has failed to do. But instead, I will give you.
I thank her for giving way, and she is absolutely right. The austerity has failed and the social security system is not providing the safety net that is required. Does she agree with me that another issue this Government needs to reflect on is the application of a proposed cap to housing benefit being paid for supported accommodation, or else this is austerity that is going to hit the most vulnerable in the future, women's refugees and other vulnerable adults in supported accommodation?
Absolutely. Statistics already show that over 80% of the cuts fall on women, and that is simply not good enough. Instead, what we have... I'll make some progress, thank you. The UK Government has fixated on a failed Brexit strategy, intent on damaging the economy and threatening jobs, so much so that the Government has cancelled next year's legislative programme. So my call to the Government benches, in closing, would be this. Stop fixating on fighting with the EU and get on with your day job of governing this country.
Hear, hear.